So, am I on? Yeah? So welcome everybody to this morning's seminar on militarization of social media, strategies and challenges. My name's Dan Smith. I'm director of SIPRI, and you are very welcome all here. As you know and can see, we have two panelists. Susan Jackson, who's a researcher at the Department of Economic History at Stockholm University, formerly a member of the SIPRI research staff, and now a SIPRI associate fellow, senior associate fellow. And on my left is Nick Robinson, who's associate professor in politics at the University of Leeds. We're going to watch a video in a moment, a quite short one, and then after that we will start straight in with a conversation with the two panelists. I want this to be like a conversation, and so I will be both bouncing questions back and forth between them and then asking to bring you in to the discussion as we go along. I think this is an extraordinarily interesting issue. This is a 4-year research project that has been conducted on social media and militarization, and the militarization of the social media space and the construction of meaning within that space. And as a result, this is a first, a really good opportunity to be discussing a major theme, a theme of much concern which has not received an awful lot of attention. I want also to welcome to this conversation the online audience who can connect and ask questions using the hashtag SIPRI events, and you can also tweet to the whole world happily with the same hashtag. And if I see you using your mobile phone during the course of the conversation, I'm going to think the best of you. And think that you are actually tweeting to the world and communicating the gems which you're picking up here. I shan't think anything bad about you. So let's straight away start, if we can, with the video. Are we dimming the lights? And we will vanish to the side so we can watch it as well. All right, so that gives us a bit of a flavor, a brief flavor of some of the output that's out there, that's filling the space. So first of all, Susan, if you can do, I mean, encapsulate, if you can, what is the problem you're addressing in this project, which you call Militarization 2.0, and what's its scale?
Right. So Militarization 2.0 is a Vetenskapsrådet, a Swedish Research Council funded project that we started in 2013, and they gave us an extra time at the end to finish it, so we're just finishing it up now. What we were concerned with is the amount of militaristic content on social media that's actually quite ignored by most researchers and ignored by policymakers, and engaged with what we think mostly in pockets or in some isolated instances rather than maybe bringing everyone together. So we were concerned with looking at the different industries that we each study on the team that I put together, to see what kinds of representations they have, how they're using industry or corporate branding in order to sell us ideas about national security as military security. The team in Sweden that I run is focused on the arms industry. Nick runs a team in the UK that focuses on military video games industry. And there's a team in Germany. Unfortunately, the researcher who was going to be on the panel is quite ill and can't be here, but they do a project on private military and security companies. And one of the things that we focus on is identity construction and how corporations present certain ideas about what it means to be citizen and what it means to support your country.
So, I mean, have you got any numbers you can give us about, what percentage, how many people are watching? I mean, the online audience is huge, right? I mean, potentially it's nearly 3 billion people are connected to the internet worldwide.
More.
Do we have any idea about what kind of numbers or proportion are watching the sort of material that you've been focusing on in Militarization 2.0?
It depends on which industry and which platform you're looking at when you're doing this kind of research. But there are about 3.8 billion internet users and 4 billion social media users, meaning that people have multiple platform accounts that they're part of. At any time, there are about 3 billion people on social media, and it could be something like this, where people are tweeting out to the world the things that we're talking about. It could be people who are watching video game advertisements or doing other kinds of things online. The difficulty is trying to put into context how many of those people are looking at these particular platforms, the arms industry and military video games, PMSC, platforms at any given time, because it's always moving. But we do have some numbers on types of level of viewership for a set of videos that we put together for the project to specifically be able to look at. I think he can talk more about this, but the big data set that you put together, I think it's 7 million comments on YouTube on a particular set, 1,000, almost 1,100 videos on the military video games industry advertisements. My viewership is a bit lower because I look specifically at the industry, but typically those industry videos are viewed on fan pages rather than on the official corporate YouTube website or channels. So it's hard to measure scale, but it's pretty big.
And in a couple of sentences, why should we be concerned about this? What are the issues of concern that both drove you, in a sense, put you into this research, and after you've studied it, that you come out of it with?
Yeah. Well, one of the motivating things about studying militarization and militarism is how much it is widely accepted without being questioned, and with sometimes not even knowingly accepting it. And in the other militarization work, which is my original field, is militarization and looking at the arms industry in different areas such as trade agreements, moving to social media and looking at corporate branding is, I think, quite important because social media is so widely used, and we often don't recognize how much content we see every day and how much our lives are actually in a visual space. And so we think that's really important. The militarism aspect is important in a sense that corporations are actually branding themselves using militarism as kind of a celebration, but doing it in a way where things are really quite hidden, right? So you have the glorification of a combat aircraft where it's test-driven by a reporter and treated like a test drive of a car. Right, and we wanted to point out the significant differences between the types of equipment that they're using, the messages that they're creating, and the types of ideas that they're selling us.
Okay, so Nick, if I turn to you, I'm father of an 8-year-old. So as far as I'm concerned, video games is a potentially evil, toxic world, which he's already on the verge of entering through the iPad and the iPhone we were stupid enough to give him for his last birthday. So you've been looking into the video gaming side. How anxious should I be?
Well, I think the thing is, I suppose if you're talking specifically about the games themselves, the military games, which is what we're interested in, most of them have an 18 certificate. Right.
Relief, at least for a decade.
So assuming that you're a responsible parent then all will be well with the world. I mean, joking aside, I mean, I think the reality is that we know that a lot of people play games at a very young age, significantly too young. And I think my concern actually is not with the conversation about violence, which is often how this is framed, but is actually with the conversations, for example, about desensitization. So, for example, we look, you know, what I know about Iraq, or what I know about Iran, or what I know about the former Soviet Union is often mediated to me through popular culture. And that those popular cultural representations in the context of war games involve shooting and destroying the enemy. So there's no diplomacy in any of these games. And that's one of the questions that we should wrestle with, is what are the messages that are coming out of these games in that way.
And I mean, do you see, have you or colleagues looked into any evidence about the behavioral and social impacts of these messages, as you say, coming out of the games?
Well, I think what we've tried to do in the project is there are two bits really. I mean, getting at the consequences of these things, we're doing it through a focus group-based methodology. So what we're specifically interested in, and I can obviously talk a little bit more about that if that's interesting, but we're specifically interested in identifying how people themselves self-identify and self-talk about their behaviours through those things. The other things we've been interested trying to get at is how we can use the comments and the things that people say in social media spaces to try and get some idea about how they feel. And certainly with the comments, for example, just to give you one example, there's quite a lot of celebration of military technology, for example. So in both Susan's spaces and in the spaces that I encounter, and that's why the industries intertextual, work together so effectively. People will talk about, oh, yo, man, that's so cool, I used it in Halo, when they're talking about a weapon system that's in Susan's video. So you've got these relationships that are being made through the popular cultural spaces towards more quote-unquote serious stuff. And
going then over to looking at the arms industry output in social media, and the same question, is there evidence material available about behavioral, social issues, questions that arise out of those messages?
Yeah. Right now, what we're doing is trying to expand the research to bring the focus group work that Nick's team did to Sweden and possibly to Germany to see what kinds of reactions people have. But I think the work that he's been looking at actually includes the arms industry videos, and they seem to the messaging that's there is the same kind of messaging you get in the military video game advertisements that you get in the army recruitment videos and things like that. And I think the overall reaction has been pretty consistent, that either you have a reception of these militaristic messages or somehow you're not receiving them. And part of that issue might be about algorithms and filtering issues, that as a user, you search for things and you look at things here, the algorithms are remembering that, and then they're filtering out what you actually get, so that maybe people who might receive militaristic messaging aren't getting it because they're not actually looking for it to begin with.
But, I mean, one thing in sort of analytical or almost philosophical terms as you go into that, if there is this sort of unified message, you're picking up the same kind of messages from these different sources, including, as you said, army recruitment, then that does suggest that the use of a concept like militarism has got a kind of, there's an evidential base to be talking about one set of ideas that's really very, very widespread. Is that a fair conclusion to be drawing?
Yes. So far what we've found is there's a lot of very similar messaging going on across the industries, especially with the military video games and with the arms industry, because of the shared equipment and kind of the shared almost, here's a virtual space and here's what's supposed to be the real world. I think one of the differences is that because a lot of the content in the arms industry is being viewed outside of official channels, it's in some ways maybe harder to capture what the connection is between the industry and the fan pages, which is something I think would be interesting to look at. Comment-wise, we've done like a more qualitative or smaller end so far in looking at that. And it is a lot about techno-fetishism, looking at the technology and glorifying it and kind of separating it away from the type of use that it's intended to have.
So a question which I wanted to ask both of you, and I'll start with you, Nick, if that's okay.
Yep.
Is really to do with yes, okay, and how new is this, right? Now, obviously, I understand that with the technology of social media and that kind of communication, in some ways, the speed and given also just population growth and shifts in world demography and economics, the numbers of people who are receiving this is new. But I was just thinking, this morning, thinking about this discussion. Going way back into the past, in 1979, 1980, the British government brought out a booklet on civil defense against nuclear attack called Protect and Survive. And E.P. Thompson, the historian, then wrote a very famous polemic about this, which he called Protest and Survive. And a few months after that, I saw in a British Defence Affairs magazine an advert which was Defend and Survive. And then in another military magazine I saw the following year for an attack helicopter, it had been changed to Defend and Destroy. Right? So there's the sort of militaristic images have been around for a long time. And while not on social media, in the old-fashioned magazines and so on, those kinds of images were being projected. And indeed, army recruitment, be the best you can be, be a real man. I mean, that's always been there. So, yeah, as well as the numbers, is there something else which is new in what you've been looking at in the social media space?
Well, I think there are two things, aren't there? One is the numbers. I mean, so just to give you an indication, that cacophony of noise that you all saw at the beginning, you might have thought that was bad ICT, was obviously deliberate. That was the point is that the intertexts are so powerful. So you've got pop videos, for example, people like Katy Perry or what have you that utilize military iconography within their things. You've got the ubiquitous presence of the military, for example, in sporting events, particularly in the United States of America. You've got the mass penetration of entertainment. I mean, these are not trivial things. The video game trailers that we're dealing with in Leeds have been watched by nearly 2 billion people, right? So, I mean, we're talking about things that have got an absolutely staggering reach. And these things make, from our perspective, this, it glorifies, makes it exciting. So what you're talking about is a visual still advertisement. But actually, what I loved about the question was that the parallels are very striking, because still the solution, for example, in a video game, is to destroy to win. So that parallel is exactly the same. So you securitize through violence in that context. That's how you actually bring the state back to a state of security, is by destroying the enemy in these popular cultural narratives invariably. So the parallels are very striking, but I do think the ubiquitous presence of it, the fact that this is overwhelmingly, a lot of it's being targeted at younger people, and or people who now don't have a direct experience of the military. And I think that's the other thing you were talking about in the era that you're referring to. Most people would have had grandparents or parents who might have fought in a war. Now our relationship to conflict is mediated to us and remediated to us through visual imagery overwhelmingly. And that, I think, is a huge difference as well.
What's new?
When we started the project, I hadn't been living in Stockholm, but I came back to Stockholm and I actually spent a week in the SIPRI archives trying to figure out what kind of basis is there in the advertising that the arms industry was typically doing, which is to engineers and journals for people who are in the industry that's making the weapons. And the difference between the still images, as Nick was saying, and these moving images is quite striking. And then over time, you have now the arms industry has gone from a very captive audience of these are engineers that are going to build these things, we need to recruit them and sell things to them, to an overall general public. None of this, you don't have to subscribe to any of these channels, they're there. And you can just go and you can look at all of these things. So I think the potential for reach is much bigger than it ever was. I think the difference between still images and the movie-like versions of equipment sales that they try to put together. And I think one of the things I found later in the research is the absence of understanding how sound changes or impacts how we receive the visual image. And so one of the things that social media can do that still images can't do, besides reach the public, is actually bring us another layer of understanding through hearing.
Another layer of understanding or another layer of receptivity?
Probably both. Yeah.
So I want to bring it out to the to you all for a moment. So if you're kind of shaping a question in your mind, be ready. But Nick, can you? I mean, as you've looked at these games, this imagery, and so on, are there apart from what was up on the video to begin with, are there a couple of images which kind of stand out in your mind, and you know, from maybe from a point of shock, you know, that's what it's actually all about, sort of that encapsulate what you're concerned about and what you think is going on?
Yeah, I think when we started the project, I think one of the things, there's been a shift, which I think I'd also like to mention, which is about the growth of kind of resistance to this in this field, which I think is worth commenting on. But I remember being struck, actually, there was a really interesting controversy in the UK in a news reporting incident where somebody showed a level from Call of Duty Modern Warfare where the news reporters actually hadn't realised, it was I think it was an ITN news bulletin, where they hadn't realised that the image that they were using was not actually from actual footage from an a helicopter gunship. It was actually from within the game, Call of Duty, and the level of death above. And I remember being really struck by that, actually thinking, wow, that's quite extraordinary, actually, that's managed to get into that kind of arena where people are now seeing this as such a visceral, you know, such a realistic, quote unquote, an authentic depiction of warfare, that it's now permeating into kind of that kind of way of thinking. But I think the thing also, though, that it's also, I suppose my last sort of comment just in this context, it's also worth bearing in mind that there's been a lot of resistance and active resistance to some of this activity. So the industry, certainly in the context of some games, has gone, quote unquote, too far. So there was a game, Medal of Honor Warfighter, for example, which had a click-through advertising campaign where you could buy sniper rifles and so forth through the website. Now, that resulted in a huge backlash, not interestingly from the mainstream media, but actually from the internet community, many of whom were military gamers who were appalled by this thing. So I think it's also worth the industry has to navigate the boundaries of what is deemed to be socially acceptable. And one of the reasons I suspect that we've moved back, say, to making games about World War II at the moment and World War I, which is because the present wars are, quote unquote, unwinnable. And that, I think, has led to the entertainment sector vacating that space because these wars are intractable, which is, again, I think, quite something worth thinking about in terms of the shifts.
Susan, again, the same question to you, an image or two that sort of encapsulate.
Yeah. I think from my perspective, some of it's a bit more situational in what Nick was just saying is, I think, using the arms production corporate branding unconditionally or nearly unconditionally and uncritically by media, where you get kind of this website thing going on where they'll just take a YouTube video from an arms producer and embed it into a story without contextualizing it as it being corporate branding. And so often you see these news items and you just kind of assume that it's more credible as a news issue than as a corporate branding tool. I think that's really quite important.
I mean, I find some of the reality versus the image kind of issue really quite telling. Just from the way that my brain works, I remember vividly where I was when 9/11 happened. And I remember when I got back to my hotel room and I was able to switch on CNN, and then they were showing film. And I looked at this film, and I mean, it's horrible, of the plane going into the building. But the question which I thought to myself was, why are they showing over and over again an image from a video game? Right? Because I'd never seen it before, it didn't look real to me. Right? Now I think we've moved on where some of that kind of imagery has become more seen, more experienced. And the way the brain works is if it looks like something I've seen before, then it's probably real. And so the more that the material is available there, I would imagine the conclusion would be that the less possible it is, or the more important it is to be making the effort to be distinguishing between the real and the image. That's where we are with.
Absolutely. I think when you look at if the arms industry, they often do what we call clean war presentation, right? So they often don't show what war is doing, and they don't involve, you know, people dying and things like that. But if they do bring in an enemy combatant of some sort, the them that we need in order to create this kind of effect, they're often computer generated, very obscure. They're not real people in the background. They're often these kind of drawings, but they feel almost authentic, like you think that might be what the situation is if you had been there. So it's very much like that, where there's a cross between virtual and real, and where do we meet that?
Let's put it out to the audience. But have you got a further comment on that, Nick, before
No.
take a question? Let's go. Let's. It's an audience in Stockholm on a wet morning, and getting. Okay. The second and the third questions have come up now. If you can each say when I call you, just briefly who you are. So Micah at the front, and then the gentleman there. I think actually you have to borrow this microphone.
Mike Verbrugge, I work at SIPRI. I was wondering about the potential for a different type of game. So, like lately in video games, games have become popular that are about storytelling very much. So, for instance, there are games like this War of Mine, which also tells about the story of the Yugoslavian wars. So, do you think that has the potential to develop some type of counter-narrative showing the horrors of war, or will it be completely outnumbered compared to modern warfare or big box type of games?
Yeah, I mean, I think this War of Mine is an absolutely brilliant game, actually, and I would totally. It's a really uncomfortable game to play, which of course is precisely the point. And I'm really delighted that you've raised it. Absolutely, I think there are spaces for counter narratives. And the other thing that's fascinating about this War of Mine, which if you haven't played it, essentially, as you say, it's not specifically about the Yugoslavian war, but it's clearly influenced by it, isn't it? So you have to survive as a civilian. You're put in. There's a group of you. You're living in a house. It's a kind of a strategy game, and it involves essentially surviving. And it throws up all kinds of really hefty ethical problems. It's grim, actually, and very difficult. And it doesn't really tell you what to do, which of course is precisely the point. So there, I think what they did with that game is they explored what you can do when you use interactivity to provoke thinking. So is there more that can be done? Definitely. Is it going to be tough to do it again? Maybe. That was also, they were really surprised by just how commercially successful that game was. So it seems to me there's like a kind of a spike where something happens and it's like a successful, critical sort of a game or reflexive kind of game. But the other games to think about, sorry, before I'll get carried away with the gaming thing, is the Metal Gear Solid series, of course, which is a huge franchise, 25, so whatever it is, million units sold. And most of those games, again, invoke a kind of more reflexive and critical kind of way of thinking. So there are games out there, actually, that are doing some really interesting things.
So my name is Pelle Sundvinsson. I'm probably one of the few that is here not as a part of my job. I have another daytime job usually, but I'm very active in different parts of the peace movement. And since the end of conscription, now it's taken back again in Sweden. Since the end of conscription in Sweden, I would say the main agent when it comes to militarization of social media in Sweden is the army, because we have all of these recruitment campaigns, and they have, for example, they have now a campaign saying that the armed forces is what make us able to live in peace, and the hashtag is in peace. So this, I would say, is so much bigger than any social media outlet that I've seen from any other private company or any weapons industry. When I follow the weapons industries, I would say, yeah, they have a few followers, but whenever there's something really big in Swedish social media, it comes from the armed forces. So I would like to know something about, like, why did you choose to exclude state armed forces and the recruitment they make from this study? And perhaps if you could say something that perhaps you still have some experience that you would share on this subject.
We chose to exclude looking at the armed forces because we specifically wanted to bring corporations into political science and international relations studies on militarism, because it's a very understudied actor in this area. At the same time, you can't really not look at military recruitment as part of a broader understanding of what is going on. So we do have some of those things. Actually, this afternoon we're giving a civil society training on understanding social media content, and one of the things that my colleague in the back there we put into the program, the slideshow, is a shot I took at Fridhemsplan Metro of exactly the ad that you're talking about, and I was wondering actually, and, you know, like, if you need the military in Sweden to make sure that there's peace, there's a change then in the narrative that they shifted away from in keeping the peace during the Cold War and making other things supposedly happen. And now there seems to be a shift back. But the other really interesting thing about that slide, and not to give it away to anyone who's in here who's you should not listen because we're gonna talk about this afternoon. One of the interesting things is when you look at the presentation of that, it's a 4-panel advertisement. It's in Sweden, for those of you who don't live here, there's a lot of advertising in the winter to go to sunny, hot places to spend your vacation, winter vacation there. And so in the metro, you get a lot of vacation advertisements. And the 4-panel advertisement, 3 of them are people swimming and jumping into a pool. And in the middle of that, you get a soldier in a kind of almost submerged coming up. So you get kind of this water, who's having fun, who's protecting you kind of thing while you're on these vacations. So we do look at these things. We just tend to focus on them as a contextual idea on how we then move into looking at how the arms industry interacts with society. And really quick, the second thing is the industry is in social media. It's just they're mostly on the fan pages. So when you look at like Saab Gripen, the big advertisements for the Gripen, you'll find many millions of more views on certain fan pages than you will on the Saab YouTube channel. So we investigate that kind of connection a bit too.
Can I just make one tiny comment? The other thing is it's a shame actually. Sorry, I'm trying to make eye contact with the gentleman who asked the question, which is making a bit of a... thank you very much, by the way. It's actually slightly unfortunate that somebody from the German team's not available to be here, because actually the recruitment theme for them is really integral to their work. They're working on the private military security side, and actually what they've found with a lot of that is that the content, the social media content, which has much lower levels of engagement actually, but it is targeted at recruitment overwhelmingly. So, and that's recruitment that's either general kind of human resources sort of work, but a lot of it is obviously targeted at former military service personnel. So they've been looking a lot at the way in which those organisations have framed their own profiles, whether they look like to be humanitarian intervention kind of organisations, the ethical norms that underpin those organisations, and so on and so forth. I mean, they could obviously speak much more to that question, but so recruitment has loomed large. And the other thing that I'd say about it is what's also becoming increasingly strikingly obvious is, I don't know how pervasive this word is in Sweden, but the word radicalisation, right, is really massive in the UK context. So social media then is seen as a recruitment tool, but for terrorist organisations. That's how it's framed in the UK overwhelmingly. One of the things that we've started to have conversations with people who deal with terrorism and social media research to say actually that the videos that we've got here, all this material, is very similar in its form to the kind of material that IS and so forth are producing. So in other words, the military industry, often to do with recruitment, produce the kind of videos that Susan's talking about popping off to an exotic location to have a holiday, fighting in a far off land and so forth. And those images are quite similar actually across these different social media spaces. So you're absolutely right that it's the kind of thing that's emerged as a really important theme here. Yeah, great question, sorry.
Yeah, that's fascinating, those parallels. We'll take another question now. There's one there. You need, again, sorry, we have to pass this to you.
Hi, my name's Cynthia Enloe from Clark University. I know here in SIPRI that there's now a new interest in the genderings of peace and of military sales. But I wondered if in this project, Nick, you and Susan, you in your own particular research projects, how you found ideas about masculinities and ideas about femininities, how they structured what you were finding, and also, if it's possible, where women were and where men were, both in the corporate arms sales, social media, but also in the video games. If you could just give us a sense of what you found, that'd be great.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
One of the things that Nick and I have discussed over the last couple of years is dealing with gender and other kinds of actual marginalizations that we tend to have. And one of the things we look at is where the women are, right? So who's being portrayed and how are they being portrayed and what roles and things like that. But also looking at gender in a more analytical sense in what kinds of gendering are in the overall messages. And one of the things that I look at is actually with an intersectional approach. I look at gender, race, and ethnicity, and heteronormativity, so how are relationships portrayed in trying to sell us ideas about national security. And looking at how, if you go onto the arms industry Facebook pages, for instance, they're very much about community because that's what that's who they're trying to reach on Facebook, right? So YouTube is a much broader category of entertainment. Facebook tends to be much more about how do we reach the communities that we're in. And so when you get holidays, for instance, in the U.S., where you'll get the 4th of July and they'll have family picnics at Raytheon or Lockheed Martin, we'll sponsor these kind of local family things. And often the couples are white, heterosexual. Often there'll be kids, right? We have a family and a community going on. And so I look at those kinds of things to contextualize what I'm doing. In the focus on the YouTube videos, there's a link between, because it's about broader projections, right? They're trying to do a global sale of these ideas and looking at how different countries portray different types of bodies to give different messages. And this intersection of kind of this, like, the white good comes and saves brown people is very, very prominent in a lot of these videos. And a lot about women, I'm flying a combat aircraft, but then you realize it's reconnaissance and she's not gonna go out and shoot anybody, right? That's what the men do. So there are just lots of these kinds of visual connections and sound connections that tell us a lot about gender and race and heteronormativity that I've been looking at. And then I think...
Yeah, I think you've probably said a lot of really good stuff on the content. So I'll only add kind of one tiny addition to that, and then I'll say something more about the reactions and engagement in video gaming. Because I think one thing that's interesting about war games is that the future war games actually are often in quite interesting ways start to make these gender relationships slightly more interesting. Gender's absolutely integral, by the way, to the project. Insofar as, for example, in Call of Duty Black Ops 3, you can select whether you play the game as a male or a female character, and indeed they've got a voice actress to play the female character and a male voice actor to play the male character. So, and in fact, in that game, all the interrelationships between all the main characters are all women, right? So it's women who are fighting this war. So that's actually quite an interesting thing where you get these differences of depictions. Most video games don't have families in them, which is actually really interesting. So the conflict is decontextualized, right, in that sense. So there is a fight going on. It's all our fight, but we're not really dealing with family. There are a couple of very small exceptions, Medal of Honor Warfighter being one particular one where there are little cutscenes between family members. What I wanted to talk a little bit about is we've got this category of video game fan material, which we've got about 50 or 60 videos that we're dealing with about 300 or so thousand comments. And some of those videos are gameplay, multiplayer gameplay, where there are men and women playing. And there is recordings of the way that those gendered interactions are occurring. And look, you don't need me to tell you what you're going to hear is not terribly pleasant on the ears. So there is a lot of very, very, very aggressive talk going on towards women video game players, and I think it's important to emphasise this isn't particular just to war games, right? This is particular to the competitive environment that video gaming seems to throw out. So it's not any better in FIFA, the football game, and it's not any better in League of Legends. And do you know what I mean? It's kind of something about the kind of combative culture that video gaming seems to throw out, and anonymity, I think. But it's really, really, really important. Yeah, really important.
Great question. Thanks. Yes, one here.
Yeah, just a quick question.
Who are you?
My name is Ilan Manor, and
Sorry.
I'm from the University of Oxford. And I was wondering if, in the use of social media, you see any attempt by the military industries to tailor their messages to specific audiences, but with regard to nationality. So if you have a company like Lockheed Martin, which is a global supplier of arms, do they tailor their online promotion videos to values, history, culture of specific nations?
Yeah. The first study I did in the project, since I do global arms industry and that's my background, was to actually do a comparison of 16 different videos from I think 8 different countries. And I started to notice that there's a universal set of messaging regardless of where the company is headquartered, but at the same time there are tailored messages based on where the companies are headquartered. So I have an article coming out actually on Saab very soon. It's in Page Proof, and it looks at the construction of Swedish identity and citizen identity through Saab's messaging, and it's very much about, if you look at the literature on Swedishness and you take that and the language that's used and the understandings of culture that have been done in cultural studies, and you go and you look at these videos, there are definite parallels. That the Swedish military uses the arms industry in Sweden in order to do humanitarian international collaborations, right? It's not an aggressive first, singular kind of situation, but they work in teams. That it's really about protecting the country here, and like the different kinds of messaging that you get through other kinds of things in Swedish advertising. You can actually see parallels in the Swedish arms industry. Advertising. And you can see this, for instance, in the US, when you look at the different kinds of the top companies. It's very, very aggressive. And it's very almost like a religious revival kind of situation. Like they'll unveil a piece of equipment and everyone hugs and high fives. And it's like a really kind of what you would expect, I guess, out of American culture. In the British situation, when you look at BAE Systems, they have a lot of, we are global, we're post-empire, we include everybody, we're really, that's the kind of thing that we do. So there are international levels that are just part of the global industry and how the industry communicates, but they often do that through including national level understandings of culture.
Do you get tailored products, tailored messages in the video gaming side?
What you get is, I think the thing that's really striking about war games, and the difference between war games, for example, and other games, is that war games are overwhelmingly made in 2 or 3 key places. France, French-speaking Canada by Ubisoft, the West Coast of North America by EA, and by Activision. Those are the big producers. And of course here in Stockholm you have EA DICE, who make the Battlefield series, which is a kind of a strange outlier in that regard. But those games are made and overwhelmingly marketed at a very specific sort of demographic. Where it gets really interesting, though, is when you get a game like World of Tanks, which is made in Belarus, and it's got a huge market, actually, which is based on the PC thing. So the big question with video gaming comes down to the technology that people can access. Mobile gaming, of course, is a very different thing. But where tailoring becomes really, really important is through conversations about localization. But what you realize, the really successful video games are the ones that have got global appeal. The Nintendo are geniuses at this, right? You know, you'll all be aware that Mario, comes out, I think it's on Friday. Now, you know, this is something that will be literally globally appealing. So that's when the industry, with things like the Wii Sports, Wii Fit, etc., etc. But the adverts, yes, they are tailored. The people that appear in them are different. The images are different. But for Nintendo, that was all about family. But I think it's quite important to emphasize that the industry works in very different ways. The other thing that I think is potentially slightly different is that the industry isn't that quote-unquote global, insofar as production is overwhelmingly dominated by a few markets, aside from in the PC sphere, where it's a little bit more quote-unquote democratic, I guess.
Take another question from you all? If not, then Micah, actually, you know, I was going to put you on the spot a bit, because was it last week that you convened a seminar here, where we talked about gendered aspects with emerging technologies. Micah works on emerging kind of exotic military technologies, the drones to robotics, cybersecurity, and so on. And in a way, I would say intuitively, not surprisingly, then, the issue of how to address gendering aspects of these technologies and their presentation and their development arise. But there's a question which some of you, I think, will be very familiar with, which is how do you make the gender thing into a thing that you can actually, you know, from a research point of view, get your hands on and get into, find evidence, and so on. And so I just wanted to ask you, Micah, and then I'll give you the microphone back, and you can see if you can answer my question a bit, and then ask your own second question. Just what the resonance is out of this conversation for your own work as you take that forward. What kind of one or two maybe takeaways are you getting from this discussion that informs your own work? Here comes the mic.
Well, you're indeed putting me up on the spot a little bit, but I think the main way it has resonated is one of the things we've been doing here is creating mapping and the development of new technology, drones, etc. So I've been looking a lot also at advertisements of weapon technology and to learn more about these technologies. So you see that all this information, where it comes from, and in what type of places is it? Can you find it? You see very like specific depictions, and the gendered aspect in marketing, for instance, is also extremely interesting. How these technologies, you know, how women are accessories can be for buying big military technology that can be makes you more masculine. So it's really interesting, and of course the gendered development of combat robots, where you see very masculine combat robots versus more feminine assistance robots. So you see very strong elements in this field. So that's I'm very interested. Maybe asking too many questions. Also added, I actually really like to play video games, so that makes me extra interested in the subject. So therefore, my question to you was, perhaps I was interested in, I mean, you say so the main development of these war games are come generally from these areas you mentioned. So do you see some type of similarities in East Asian gaming development, because they make so many games as well. They also often play a lot of Western games, and Korea, China, they make a lot of military technology as well. So is there not a similar militarization in social media in East Asian countries, or is this more a Western phenomenon? And why do you think this is?
Right. Okay. That's a great question, and you've probably pushed at the limits of what I know in some regards, to be honest. There are, for example, I mean, partly this is a language problem that I have and my own weaknesses. As you can see, I'm not speaking fluently in anything other than English, of course. But part of the difficulty, I think, is just getting access to that kind of content. So the Chinese, for example, have made a game called Glorious Mission, which is very similar in its form to the US-based game America's Army. In other words, it's a game that's been designed in part to enthuse people about the values of the Chinese military. And originally there was quite a lot of kickback about all of that, and the Americans got quite upset about it all, and they were just saying, well, you know, we're just creating a game which is kind of a bit like the one that you've already got in America's Army. So the idea of gamifying interest in the military by the state there, I think, is quite pervasive. And historically, Hezbollah and people have also been involved in the video game development. So we have a kind of this sort of culture. I don't know enough, though, if I'm honest with you, about how militarization of social media has occurred in other parts of the world. What is, I guess, quite striking about part of what you're doing as well, about the synergies really, is that the recreationalization of drones is quite an interesting thing, whether they become toys that we buy for Christmas presents, whether they become the new thing that's going to deliver us our packages by some global corporation from a warehouse, which will remain nameless, or whether they become embodied within games, right? So drones in video games are totally ubiquitous. They're very easy to control. They create great assets to the player, and so on and so forth. So the idea that the drone has become normalized, I think, in these kinds of spaces is really, really important. And it might be the case that there's a kind of a remediation and mediation going on between our cultural imaginary of what a drone is through entertainment and then what you're then seeing in these kinds of spaces. I mean, that's also a possibility, it seems to me.
Susan, do you have something to put in on this East Asia, the rest of the world? Is this a Western phenomenon? Is it a broader phenomenon? Does it take different shapes in different places?
Right. I think one of the things I wanted to follow up within this context on something that Nick said is about language. It's not, I think, just the restriction on how many languages do the researchers speak, but in my particular industry, most of the advertising that they're putting out, the corporate branding videos and different things are done in English. Because it's not just for the local communities and for the domestic audiences. They want to have this messaging being accessed abroad. And when you have smaller companies, or you have companies that are in countries where English isn't widely known necessarily, they just eliminate language and they only have sound with music. So they'll showcase the equipment, but it'll all be to music. And if they want to put something on screen, it'll often be the title, and it's often a military personnel person who's unveiling something. And it's easy enough to translate that message that it's Lieutenant so-and-so or General so-and-so, unlike doing an entire video and trying to translate what that might be. You have companies that are in countries like Sweden that are bilingual for the most part, or very close to, and they actually produce everything in English with subtitles. And then they just subtitle it around the world so they can sell it. So when we were at a conference, Nick and I, in September, and I gave a presentation on my latest article. And one of the audience members she was from Brazil, and she said that campaign was blasted around Brazil. It was when Brazil was Saab was trying to sell grip end to Brazil, and it was everywhere. She said on TV, bus kiosks. It was in the bus. It was, and railroad stations everywhere in Portuguese. And so language is really important, not just as a researcher, but also as a producer of these things, on what kinds of things are they trying to get across and how well can they do it. And then the comment section. So it depends on if you're on the industry pages or if you're in the fan pages, because then you get a lot more languages in the fan pages than you do in the corporate sites.
So, sorry, there's a hand at the back I couldn't see, sorry.
Hi, my name is Kate Broussard. I'm from the Life and Peace Institute. It's a Swedish peacebuilding organization. I'm generally interested. I saw a subheading in your report. I haven't read it yet. What are the policy implications you're going towards with this work, which seems like it would have a lot? And in particular, I'm from the U.S., if you can tell, and I'm really interested in the question about the good counter-narrative kind of gaming, because I've seen a documentary recently on the role that the military in the U.S. has played in censoring Hollywood and its presentation of the CIA or the U.S. Army, and it's really censoring and saying, no, we won't allow you access to our submarines for your footage if you don't present us in a way that we approve. And so how could that come into this world? And also if there's going to be kind of not anti-U.S. military gaming, but something that challenges the image they would like to put forward.
To start, I think, with some of the basic recommendations, which actually will then feed into, I think, some of the things that I'm expecting Nick will comment on. One of the things that we recommend is that we have more critical assessment training, whether it be among policymaker staff, whether it be at places like SIPRI or other think tanks, whether it be with CSOs in general and activist organizations. Because one of the problems I think there is the ubiquitous, the presence of just presenting corporate branding in mainstream media as the message, as opposed to any kind of analysis or critical assessment of where that might fit. And I think giving legitimacy to corporate branding without making it news is really problematic. And I think that fits with my industry. I think it fits with the stuff that Nick's looking at. I think it fits with the PMSC work that the German team has been looking at. And I think it fits with the military recruitment. I mean, it's this message of celebrating militarism unquestioningly and uncritically is really problematic. And it's legitimized by not critiquing it in the media stuff that we get. So I think one of the things that we have talked about is this kind of critical assessment training. And I have a colleague in the back who wants to bring these kind of ideas to K through 12, right, to elementary and high school levels. We should be talking about this at universities because we're losing a critical thinking. We're losing critical thinking, as we can see with the growth of things like fake news. That said, it also means we need to diversify staff. Policy makers in the diplomatic community, that we need to have people who have varied backgrounds and that have varied kind of perspectives. So that you bring in political science and media studies and maybe psychology and all sorts of different things in order to understand what social media messaging is. Because I think right now a lot of organizations put their things out there, but they're not really sure how to fit that into the other things that are going on and broader messaging. And then there's some other points that I think actually Nick will probably cover because they fit a bit with the other part of your question.
Yeah, sure. And I think, the one other thing I think we ought to, just the other recommendation that we have is also we're very, socially, I think we're quite ignorant of the power of algorithms and the way in which social media works, actually. And one of the things that we found is that, which is a good thing in a way, is that the vast majority of people don't ever see any of this content, even though it's being watched by billions of people. But those who see it, see a lot of it. And gamers, actually, what's really interesting is the video gaming community are the segue between the kind of content that Susan's got, the military recruitment advertisements. So in other words, YouTube and some of the algorithms that appear to be built into there seem to target more effectively this kind of other macro militarism messages via people who are interested in video gaming. So they clearly, the industry and the algorithms built in appear, at least, to have some capacity to interrelate these things. So that in and of itself, I think, we just kind of have a right to know a little bit more, I think, about how those algorithms are working. And we've given a lot of power to social media companies, actually, and I think we ought to be a lot more questioning of what that means. And particularly, I think we should challenge the conversation by starting from the word radicalization. I think we should, if we are saying that radicalization of social media. That, in other words, social media is an agent that changes people and makes them go off and fight in a war. If that's what we're actually saying it can do, which I've got certain questions about, but let's assume that we are, then we ought to at least be asking the question whether the militarization of social media might also be sending people off to war. And that is an ethical and moral and normative question that we should be asking, particularly in the context where, in the UK context, people can join the military at 16. And we might want to ask a question, similarly, if you can target this content at people, they can join the military at 16 and they can't buy a beer, whether there might be some ethical and moral imperatives that we could be wrestling with slightly more effectively. I think the counter-narratives question that you raised, I think, I think what I'd like to make sure, I don't want to come across as somebody just beating up on the video gaming industry exclusively, because it is, aside from places like This War of Mine, it's fair to say that some of these games, like war films, right, there are ambiguities in some of these things, which it's not quite totally clear what they mean, but they're important to emphasize. So, for example, Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, which features Kevin Spacey in it, reappraising his role that he does from the US program that's now completely gone out of my head. House of Cards, thank you. That's why I had you here. That's really interesting, because what ends up happening as the narrative unfolds is that the enemy is actually a private military services corporation, right, which you then vanquish through your actions. So, I mean, what do we mean? What do we make of a game like that, right? This is a mainstream military shooter which exposes corrupt militarism as the actual cause of war. I mean, the Battlefield 1 game, for example, has got recently released by EA, has got a much more empathetic connection to soldiering and the tragedies of the First World War. The Call of Duty modern World War II game that's coming out in November has apparently spent a huge amount of time thinking seriously about dealing with issues like PTSD in that game. Now, I don't know whether they'll do that. I haven't played that one yet. Obviously, it hasn't come out. But, there is, I think, the industry itself is starting to ask much more interesting questions, even in mainstream games. So they're more complicated, right, and ambiguous. And I suspect part of that is because it's hard to make unambiguous war games at the moment when we're just not, quote unquote, winning. And that does create, I think, the industry in that sense is responsive to what's going on in places like Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so forth, where we've got kind of bogged down in these conflicts.
But also, if the industry is, in some senses, responding to something, then that means that discussing the policy implications, which is a discussion about, well, what can be done, has traction. I mean, the industry is not a monolith, just produce. It's profit-making enterprise. It's thinking about its market. They're thinking about reputation as well. Mm-hmm. You talked earlier about that instance of the online community that was the audience, absolutely calling out the game for having this click-through advert. So a question which I wanted to ask as we move towards the last phase of the discussion is, okay, we've got a sense of the problem, we've got a sense of the scale, we've got a sense of some of the behavioral social impacts, political impacts, which can and do flow from this. And we've started to get into the question of, okay, so what can be done from a policy point of view? Just thinking a little bit away from the policy world first, what do you think people, citizens, need to know? What kinds of knowledge? I mean, algorithm is a word which we bat around now. We never used the word algorithm, it's kind of 15, 20 years ago. Discussion about the Brexit campaign, the EU referendum campaign in the UK, has raised questions about political marketing. And everybody in Britain now is developing a point of view about algorithms. First of all, have a point of view, and later find out what they are, the usual way in which you have a political discussion. So what kinds of knowledge, what areas do we, as individuals, as people, need to be knowing more about? You're having a training session this afternoon with civil society activists and organizations. What sort of information do they need to have? where do we need to put the effort of extra knowledge?
Okay. I think one of the things we emphasize in the afternoon training is trying to understand meaning construction, because it's coming at us so fast and in a much different way than when we all read the same newspaper or we all watched the same 3 news broadcasts, and we could have some kind of broader conversation and build opinions. We might disagree, but we both saw SVT last night, that kind of thing. We saw the same programs. I think now with social media, there are these barriers that are being raised where there are blocks of users that don't communicate with anybody else. And we have a real problem with things like echo chambers, where you only go places where you already agree, and then you only agree with things you already agree with, and it just keeps going, and then you end up in these little pockets or these echo chambers. And I think one of the things that we need to be more responsible about is trying to figure out how to take this research and be able to talk to civil society and to other people, to look at how meanings are constructed and the way that corporate branding, because social media is essentially, designed as a meeting place for people to be able to, what are you doing tonight? I mean, way back when, and in a way for companies to sell things. And so this kind of messaging is really important that we understand about meaning construction and the way that things are kind of hidden, and we just are sold ideas about what it means to be who we are.
So meaning construction, how the meanings get set up and communicated and how we respond to them, that's one area. Nick, you have another to add to that?
What, and where we should start? Yeah, I think we have to start really with schools and with parents. If that's what you mean by the question. I mean, you mentioned you've got an 8-year-old child. I have a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old. So my kids kind of originated, as it were, and grew up in and around the accelerations of technology. And what is extraordinary now, I think, is that in everybody's pocket now we have something that's more powerful than a laptop 5 years earlier. So with all of that, I think comes huge amounts of ethical response. Now, kids inevitably experiment, right? They faff about and have a look and see, search things out, right? So it seems to me that one of the questions that we need to think a little bit about is how on earth we manage that as parents. I think it's a really, really big challenge. I have no idea what the answers are, but I know that we need to have a social conversation about what it means to give that amount of technology and that amount of unregulated technology to children. And I think part of the problem here, and I don't know whether it's different in Sweden, so forgive my ignorance, but in the UK, what's becoming very clear is that with, for example, pressures on resources and books and all the rest of it, that teachers very quickly utilize technology as a way of overcoming the resource restrictions that exist in education. So they say, use the internet, search for things and all the rest of it. And the kids aren't very good at are not critically reflexive about the content that they're receiving, right? So whether it be Brexit advertising, whether it be fake news, whatever it is, then they arrive in the first year of an undergraduate degree program, and we have to actually try and educate people about the fact that the internet hasn't gone through things like peer review, which sounds desperately kind of, banal to say to these characters, what is peer review? Oh, who cares? But we're trying to talk about quality control a bit. And I just think as a society, the echo chamber thing, it's just so extraordinary how we've just become so balkanized in how we communicate. And I think that is really something that is a real problem, actually. We've got to break through that somehow.
I mean, I'm interested by the echo chambers that don't communicate with each other. It's as a visual metaphor. It's very powerful. And what takes you into an echo chamber? Partly it's the way that we think, because we like to talk to people who agree with us and give us positive feedback by nodding their head and smiling and so on. And it's kind of yes, that's enjoyable. It's much more enjoyable than talking with somebody about something. They look at you stony faced and then they're going to kind of come back in your face, unless you happen to like conflict. I guess some of us do some of the time, but we like the positive feedback. So that takes us into echo chambers, right? Because we're social animals. The second thing is that, I think a lot of work on behavioral psychology has shown that the reflexive part of our brain, the deep thinking part of our brain, is also a little bit lazy. and will sort of lie on a sofa in the corner of the brain room, doing nothing, and will look up and see that, oh, you've got this figured out? Okay. And so it's the quick thinking part of our brain, the intuitive bit. And of course, in the intuitive bit, things which fit together and make sense in a way that they did last week, last year, 10 years ago, those are the things which we're relying on, and they get us through the day in a perfectly efficient way. And in fact, if we had to reflect on every single thing with the our most powerful thinking part of our brain, we wouldn't be able to get through the day. You'd be sort of stuck at the Pendeltog with a card in your hand, figuring out exactly what the logic is, which allows you to just flash the card at the machine and through you go. So that's the second thing, the way our brains work take us into the echo chamber. And then the third thing, right, which is indeed the way the algorithms take us into the echo chamber, because they work on the basis that you will be interested in what you were interested in. And they narrow that down. I mean, I was looking for a new watch at one point, and for the last 2 years, every time I get on the internet, some damn watch advert comes up at me. I just can't shake the thing. So you've got these different lines forcing it, or pushing us, pulling us and pushing us into the echo chambers. And it seems to me that what you're saying, if I put it into that context, is not just that we need more critical assessment about the algorithm and about the internet, but we need to strengthen up that critical assessment faculty overall. It's not just about sort of thinking about how the technology works. It is actually thinking about how society and culture works.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we're finding, if you look at the technology and science literature, if you look at the media studies literature, and you look at the empirical stuff that we're finding in our different parts of the project, is just this growing disconnect between social and technological, that there's an assumption that technology is somehow inherently neutral, and that somehow we're just going to know how to work with it. And we let that go on for long enough that we're now in a kind of very scary place of how do we pull back and put the social back into the technological. And I think that's part of the diversification of staffs. When I meet with computer science, like I go to computer science conferences and trainings, one of the things they always say is it's really amazing, we need social science. And they're starting to kind of wake up to this idea that maybe political science and media studies and these kinds of areas should actually be brought into technological discussions on where are we going next and what kinds of things are we going to develop. And I think as a community, we should be pushing for more of that interaction so we can bring society back into technology discussions.
Nick?
Yeah, I mean, that is tough, isn't it, Susan? I think. I mean,
really
every
tough.
time I have a chat with a computer scientist or somebody who does big data, they use the word analysis, and I use the word analysis, and we realise after an hour and a half that we don't actually mean the same thing at all. So, I mean, it's really difficult, actually, and you've got to be willing to go back to the kind of intellectual kindergarten and say, actually, I genuinely haven't got the first idea what you're talking about, so you're going to have to treat me like the stupidest person that you ever met in your life, which is quite a humbling thing, in a good way, maybe. Discuss. But you're right, and I think one of the things, I guess, I mean, I like the point as well that you were making about the intuitive versus deep thinking question. And I sort of was wondering a little bit about what we do about that, actually. Because on the one hand, it reminds me of the kind of, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, Marx's religion is the opiate of the people, and maybe we could think social media is the opiate of the people here in this sense. And it just seems to me that there is, you can do a lot of deep thinking on social media. But the part of the problem with the echo chambers is that even the deep thinking is in those echo chambers, right? So I'm staggered by the kind of, for example, the people who, I've read some quite interesting stuff on why people are not voting at the moment, right, recently. And one of the things that comes out of why people are not voting, why they did vote for Brexit, of course, which is a different sort of thing, but why they're not voting in general elections often is because they're getting all the information that they need from social media or the internet, and that information tells them that these people are crooks and can't be trusted. So it's and a lot of them are conspiracy theorists, and they've got a lot of evidence to back up their viewpoints. So that is a real problem, actually, when the the mainstream is actually, it's seen as an echo chamber in and of itself, because the echo chambers become actually full of very deep thinking, and it's getting deeper, actually.
There's another question here from Cynthia.
Just coming back to Nick's
Okay.
point about introducing the idea of peer review, and this is really about, maybe it's about recommendations, and that is structure matters, right? I was, probably some of the others of you were here too, there too. I was at the other big Washington march, which was last March, for science, the March for Science, right? Which was amazing. All these feminists, including myself, who've been doing critiques of scientific thinking for the last 20 years, came out for science. It was very interesting. But one of the groups that got the loudest cheer was 3 cheers for peer review. And there were hundreds of people on the Washington Mall cheering for peer review. What struck me about that was it was about structure. It was saying, you know, the New York Times, one of the reasons it doesn't always get it right, but one of the reasons it's treated as somewhat reliable is because they have 6 levels of editorial review for every article that appears in the New York Times. And I think in a lot of organizations, including the ones you're looking at, not just the ones we're all in, it is the lack of serious structural reflexivity built in to the organizational systems that allow some of these things to go forward.
I think added to that is the issue of speed, right? One of the things that has changed with social media that we didn't really have before, I mean, a bit as the internet grew, right? You'd have more things coming around, and we knew with the CNN effect type of ideas that, you know, with that, like, I mean, this idea goes back far to we have to, you know, be more present. Things are happening really fast, 24-hour news cycle. The difference now is it's not just time-wise, but the speed has to be across. You have to address a lot of different things all at the same time, and you have to constantly do it. So when you're online, you know, if there are no things to update, you just send something with a new headline, and it looks like it's an update, even though it might be the same thing. So I think speed maybe contributes a bit to sloppiness, right? Because we're supposed to do it very quickly. Right. And then the other thing is because of resource cuts, right? You don't have, like, if you're looking, for instance, at news programs, you no longer have a reporter in every conflict area. There are too many conflicts and not enough reporters. And so you get someone who's here this day, and they don't really build up a long-term knowledge, because not all of them. There are some very good in their journalists, but a lot of them will be there for a couple of days, and then they have to go to the next crisis. And so you're losing that kind of depth that you might have. Then the structure gets in the way of that speed and that depth, because you're needing to constantly fact-check things are changing, or that you don't have the resources on the ground as far as a news thing goes. Yeah, social media peer review, I don't know how we would do that. We have to think about that, though. Maybe this afternoon.
Nick, your thoughts on
Yeah,
this?
I mean, I love the idea of people cheering for peer review. I think that's just the most bizarre image. I think I might have to get that video and shove it up somewhere. That sounds great. I mean, I also think the structure, it's really important what you're saying, actually. And I'm just minded, I suppose, of the kind of optimism, the euphoric optimism in and around the sort of Arab Spring moment, when the smartphone, as it were, would bring down the government, as it were. And I think that's also part of this, isn't it? It's the idea that we can all become credible journalists now. And that, like the Boston marathon bombing, when the news media really struggled to understand how to cover that, because constantly they were getting information, right? They were trying to fact check it. It was coming from multiple sources. Where are these people? They're kind of moving around all over the place. And it was just a really fascinating moment when you saw that the conventional news and what values might be and the structures that they rely on were getting really kind of overtaken by what was going on around them, because everyone else was giving the news more quickly than they were. So I think it's really incredibly important, this, because we do want it now, don't we? Exactly. I totally agree. Yeah, absolutely. We all want it now.
I mean, it's one of the things that is very important for us as an institute, for SIPRI, because we need to take the time to actually get the evidence in on whether it's military spending, arms transfers, the nuclear weapons, what's happening in arms control front, and so on. And we are quite often asked for instant opinions. Right? And I mean, the second thing is, it's quite interesting, the discipline which is required to say that we're going to stick with the evidence and we will go where the evidence takes us. Not stick with the evidence in the sense of have nothing to say apart from here is a fact, but a conclusion or a policy recommendation must be firmly based on evidence which allows you to sustain the chain of logic through. Whereas in normal life, a normal discussion, I mean, even flights of fancy are actually to be welcomed, right? But they certainly, there is a darker side to that, which is that the flight of fancy that becomes the conspiracy theory and becomes the very selective use of evidence to support a case. Because as you said, there's one of the problems is there is always evidence available. And you have to be looking at the non-evidence and the counter-evidence as much as anything. We're now into the last 2 or 3 minutes of the seminar. And so I wanted to give you both an opportunity to finish off. I mean, I guess there are 2 kinds of general questions that I could ask at this point, and you can pick and choose. One is, supposing you were sitting here and you had ministers of the government, let's say of Sweden, but it could be the UK if you want, of your choice. Right, so that might be the foreign secretary. No, you wouldn't want. No. It might be the homes. No. Okay. Sorry. For the online audience, obliterate that from the future record.
It's already been tweeted.
Yes, because everything is instant, of course. But minister of your choice, whether it's from that kind of traditional policy establishment, or the ministries of culture, education, whatever. 2 or 3 ministers you can have in front of you, and you know they're going to be receptive. What is it that you would be saying to them about how this issue should be treated? And the alternative question, which you can choose instead, is what would you like these people sitting here and the online audience to take away now? What are the 1 or 2 things that, whatever else these people have understood from this conversation and your presentation, these things please hold on to because they matter. So Nick first, then Susan.
Okay, great questions. I think there are 2 things I think would be interesting. I'm very minded that, and it came actually from the question over here earlier, that video games should be treated as art. So this is why I feel that it's very important that we don't beat up too heftily on the industry, because it's very easy and glib to frame the industry in a very particular kind of way. And as a result of that, so for example, state aid has been given to communities, like the Inuit community in northern Canada, to make games where they can represent their own cultural practices. So one thing I would like to have is a more systematic conversation. Obviously in the UK, if we were still members of the European Union, then maybe I'd be speaking to people there, but about actually a more systematic support for the video games industry on the basis that there are some really artistically valuable stories and messages that could be said, and they could be about gender, they could be about anti-war, they could be about whatever. So that's one thing. The second thing is I do feel that we ought to start to use the conversations that we're having in this project about militarization to start to question a little bit some of the assumptions about radicalization. I think that's, for me, the big takeaway. So the takeaway for people in the room would be, I think, that latter point.
Okay. I'll just build on Nick's instead of repeating, because we agree actually on quite a bit of what things need to be done. I think to reach out to a more policy level or government level community, I would recommend community and business work with the government, that the government reach out, the policymakers reach out and bring together communities into business discussions about where technology is going and what kind of rights people should have. Because I think there's an exclusion. Right now there's a focus on creating a good business environment. I think to people here or people who are out in the World Wide Web listening to this conversation, I would recommend to be alert if you can find trainings, whether they be podcasts or something online. If you can email with me if you want more information about the tool that we're developing that we're going to test this afternoon. Ask questions and be very curious about the different kinds of things that are being messaged to you. On the last part, I just want to, I didn't say it at the beginning and I had meant to, but I want to thank Vetenskapsrådet, the Swedish government, for supporting this grant because it's been really generous and this work wouldn't have gotten done otherwise. And I really want to thank SIPRI for hosting us. It was been a big communal effort at the Institute to bring together the audience here, the audience online, as well as the researchers and the NGOs, the CSOs that we brought in for the afternoon event also. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you for thanking us, but let me say that it's a real pleasure and a really great interest to have this event here and to have this discussion. I think that what you have been doing with this discussion is something which is very much in the SIPRI vein, which is to be grounding a discussion over an issue of major concern in the evidence, shaping the discussion out of that. What is actually happening? What is going on? What questions need to be asked and discussed further? And what I take away from this is that point. What we need is some further work, I think, identifying the questions and taking the discussion forward and seeing which are the communities and the constituencies that need to be involved in different parts of this discussion and how. So we finish this with a lot of open questions, but you know, for researchers, open questions are the grist to our mill. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thank you to the online audience, and especially thank you to our two panelists and the rest of their research teams for doing all of this. And that's your lot.
Yeah, thank you all.